As we mentioned early in the show, that DeShaun Foster is the new head football coach at UCLA. Jon Wilner, Wilner Hotline, joins us on 365 Sports. And, John, this was a quick turnaround after the Chip Kelly news in Ohio State became official on Friday. Did UCLA get it right?
You know, I'm not sure that they did. It's going to take a few years, I think, to figure that out. And that's partly because UCLA's got a whole bunch of other problems besides the identity of the head coach. There's some stuff that involves the school itself and the financial situation, the NIL situation, that, you know, it's more than just a head coach. So we'll see. They got a brutal schedule next year in the Big Ten, and they got to keep their roster together, which I think is part of the reason they went quickly. Right? Because you got that 30-day window, and they didn't want their roster to get poached, but they've got a long haul ahead of them.
John, what happened with Chip Kelly and UCLA where it got so sour so fast?
Well, I think what happened is that, and this is my guess, I think that Chip, they were going to bring him back, right? They won 8 games. They beat USC by 18 points. He had an $8 million buyout. There was no way they were going to cut him loose. But I think what happened over the winter, you know, December, January, is he kind of got some cold feet. And Jimmy Sexton's his agent, and Sexton's aggressive. And my guess is they're looking at the schedule for next year, and they're seeing that his buyout dropped from $8 million to $4 million next year. I mean, they got to play LSU on the road in addition to the Big Ten schedule. So I think that they got a little bit of cold feet, and they knew the buyout was going down, and then you add on top of it the fact that Chip doesn't like to recruit. He doesn't like NIL. He doesn't like the transfer portal. Chip just wants to call plays like he did Oregon in 2010. And that's not what being a head coach is anymore, right? So I think you put all that together, and it's like, you know what? It's time to get out. And he's very close friends with Ryan Day. He was Ryan Day's offensive coordinator when Day played at New Hampshire. So they go way back. And now he just gets to call plays, which is what he wants to do.
John, you know there's the big, great conversation happening right now about the state of college football and where it's headed and all of that. And you kind of touched on it there at the end. Do you chalk this up as one of those signs of, man, being a college football head coach just isn't cracked up? Or do you think those other things outside of not liking the NIL, not liking the recruiting, weigh just as heavy, if not heavier?
You know, I don't think it was all one thing. But I do believe that, you know, there's a lot of coaches, especially the older, you know, the guys that grew up, you know, cut their coaching chops in the 80s and 90s, you know, Kelly's age, late 50s. A lot of them are like, you know what, I'm going to keep doing this, but I don't like it. You know, this is not what I signed up for. I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, next off season we see a couple of more guys like Jeff Hafley or Chip Kelly who just say, you know what, I'm done with this. I want to be a coordinator. I want to go to the NFL. And the thing is, it's going to change even more dramatically in a couple of years when there's revenue sharing with the players, right? I mean, that's going to be a whole new ballgame.
He has been DeShaun Foster on that staff for almost every year since he stopped playing football, the 1 year at Tech, and then he had just taken the job with the Raiders. Was his name even brought up as a candidate when Kelly resigned or left, on Friday?
Yeah, he was one, you know, he was like, well, if they want to just stay in-house, they would give, I don't even think Foster had moved to Las Vegas yet or even started working for the Raiders. I'm not sure that had happened. But, you know, part of their calculation was, what do we do to keep the coaching staff together and keep the roster together? And going into the Big Ten, I think they felt like we can't allow our roster to get gutted, go into the Big Ten and go 2-10, right? In the first year, we got to do whatever we can to be successful in next fall, and keeping the roster together and the coaching staff together were the biggest components to that. And Foster was the best bet to do that. If they had brought somebody else in, you know, Tony White, who's he's Matt Rule's defensive coordinator at Nebraska, he played at UCLA, you know, there's no guarantee that even though he's a Bruin, he's going to keep the staff and the roster together. With Foster, that was the best bet to get some stability.
John, What are the problems you illustrated earlier with UCLA? They've never really outlaid a bunch of money for football anyways. There's spending issues there. What's the whole picture?
Well, the whole picture is, they've got a chancellor who is actually retiring. That's another, complication of this whole thing. But their chancellor for years has not really cared about football. They don't support athletics. The school doesn't really support athletics like other schools do financially. They've got, they lost, or they had a $30-40 million shortfall, operating budget shortfall last year. That's a regular thing. So they're coming in, with a real financial squeeze. They have no NIL game. Their admissions bar is higher than, the Oregons and the USCs. It's a little tough to get players in. But generally speaking, I look at it like, a school like Ohio State or Michigan, they are all in with football across the campus, right? It's an institutional commitment to winning in football. USC has that. Oregon has that. UCLA does not have that. And you could make the case that they shouldn't because they've got more of an academic mindset. But it makes it much harder to compete with those other programs if you are not all in. And if your chancellor's not out there trying to raise money for your NIL collective and that kind of thing. So that's part of what I'm talking about.
John, so we know USC's all in and UCLA's is not, as you point out there. Feel pretty good about, just basically the general state of things, I guess, with the teams coming to the Big 12. I know Arizona schools have a lot of things to work out. What are kind of the sentiments you're getting right now, though, when it comes to Stanford and Cal? Is there uneasiness over what's going on out on the East Coast right now with Florida State? Are they pretty secure and not having to really worry about things? I'm just sort of wondering where their heads are at this point with the big move next season going cross-country.
Yeah, fingers crossed, right, that the ACC stays together. And then what happens if it doesn't, right? There's a whole bunch of scenarios if Florida State leaves and Clemson, North Carolina leaves. But, they got a reminder, Cal and Stanford got a reminder of what their life is going to be like last week or 2 weeks ago when the ACC released a football schedule. Cal's opening at Florida. The first conference game is at Florida State. Stanford's first game in the ACC is at Syracuse on a Friday night. Their second game in the ACC is at Clemson the next weekend. And in between the trip to Syracuse and the trip to Clemson, Stanford starts their fall academic quarter. So that is like what their lives are going to be like. And then the ACC just went ahead last week and released the championship sites. All the tournaments and the championships for Olympic sports, they're all going to be in North Carolina. So it's going to be really challenging for those two schools and for their athletes. And that's over and above, whether the ACC collapses or not, or whether Florida State and Clemson leave and there's like a shell of itself remaining that Stanford and Cal are contractually bound to. They signed a 12-year grant of rights.
John, how would you describe the feeling about UCLA football, regardless of this move with Chip Kelly and Foster being hired? How would you describe the interest overall in UCLA football?
It's lukewarm. I mean, it's a basketball school, right? I mean, it's closer to Kentucky and Kansas and Duke than it is to USC and Ohio State and Alabama, right? I mean, that's its DNA. It's got 11 national championships. So they support, if their football team is really good, they'll support it. You'll get 70,000 people in there for a good game if they're real good. But, Chip Kelly's been there for 6 years. The fans have been turned off. So it's solid, but it's not passionate. I mean, of the 12 schools in the Pac, out here in what was the Pac-12, their fan base is for football, second bottom tier for passion, for sure.
Thank you, John. I don't think this slows things down because nothing ever slows down anymore in college football, but
it's crazy.
Yeah. And I know you were busting it today. Thanks for responding. I know you wrote the column about Foster and UCLA. We do appreciate you very much.
Love coming on your show. Thank
you. Jon Wilner, the Wilner Hotline, and yet another